The night air over the Spencer estate felt unnaturally still, as though the house itself had been holding its breath for weeks. Ever since Luna's escape and the leak of her final letter, the one written with trembling hands and filled with equal parts confession and farewell, the family had been unraveling thread by thread. The chaos had consumed Will, who seemed determined to defy the world for the sake of a dying woman's dignity, and it had shaken Bill to the core, forcing him to confront every compromise he had made in the name of power. But it was Katie, caught between them, who bore the quietest and most dangerous cost. Her suffering didn't explode in the headlines or draw the attention of the city. It happened in whispers, in sleepless nights, in the silent collapse of a heart too tired to keep carrying the pain of others. It started with something small. A skipped heartbeat here, a moment of dizziness there. At first, Katie dismissed it as anxiety, the inevitable toll of months spent navigating a moral minefield she never asked to walk. Every day seemed to bring a new crisis, another press leak, another argument between father and son, another plea from Will to believe that Luna wasn't the monster the world made her out to be. Katie wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to. But she also remembered the fear in his eyes the night he came home soaked in seawater, carrying Luna's lifeless body across the sand, screaming for help while the waves swallowed the footprints behind him. Since then, every sound of the ocean on the news, every whisper of Luna's name, triggered something deep and uncontrollable inside her. Sleep became impossible. She would close her eyes and see Luna's face, sometimes pale and pleading, sometimes accusing. The doctor's reports flashed in her dreams. The cancer, the miscarriage, the blood on sterile sheets. In her nightmares, Luna stood at the edge of the surf, whispering Will's name while the tide turned red. Katie would wake gasping, her heart racing violently, sweat chilling her skin. She told herself it was stress, nothing more. But she couldn't ignore how each episode left her weaker, how her chest seemed to ache longer each time. The Spencer legacy had always been built on denial, pretend long enough, and you could make reality bow to your will. Katie had learned that from Bill, but she also knew how dangerous that philosophy could be. Still, she kept quiet. She had always been the stabilizer, the one who softened Bill's sharp edges and steadied Will's impulsive storms. To admit weakness now would mean becoming another problem to fix, another crack in a foundation already trembling. So she smiled when she needed to, nodded when Bill ranted about reputation, and prayed in silence that Will would come home safe from whatever reckless mission Luna had dragged him into next. The city might have turned Luna into a cause, but for Katie, she was a haunting, a living reminder of the line between love and destruction, and how easily her son had crossed it. Then came the threats. Anonymous emails, cryptic messages slipped under the estate gate, social media accounts that seemed to know far too much about their private lives. Some were clearly from trolls. Others felt more deliberate, like someone testing how far they could push before the Spencers broke. The police couldn't trace most of them, but one message in particular made Katie's blood run cold. You can't save him. The sea will take him next. Will had laughed it off when she showed him, but she could see the flicker of fear behind his defiance. He had begun spending more time alone, often disappearing late at night, driving to the beach where Luna had once tried to end her life. Katie begged him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. I have to make her see reason, he said. I have to end this before it ends me. That was when the nightmares became unbearable. She started hearing the ocean even when she was awake, the crash of waves echoing through the walls, the faint scent of salt water in her room. Her pulse would spike without warning, her vision blurred. There were moments when she could feel her heart pounding so violently it frightened her. But she said nothing. Bill was already consumed by guilt, retreating into his office for hours, trying to rebuild the company's fractured reputation while privately funding legal efforts to clear Luna's record. Katie knew that if she collapsed now, everything would fall apart. The breaking point came on a gray afternoon when Will announced he was going to the coast again. She's out there, he said, his voice taut. She left another letter. I need to see her one last time. Katie stood in the doorway, trembling.
No, Will.
You can't keep chasing ghosts. But he was already grabbing his keys. The argument escalated quickly, her voice sharp with fear, his with desperation. When he finally stormed out, Katie felt a surge of panic unlike anything she'd ever known. She ran after him, ignoring Bill's calls for her to stop, and followed his car down the coastal highway. By the time she reached the beach, the sky was darkening. Will was already near the waterline, shouting Luna's name into the wind. The tide was rising fast, and the waves crashed violently against the rocks. Katie tried to call out, but her voice was lost in the storm. She stumbled through the sand toward him, her heart hammering, her breath ragged. She caught his arm just as he took a step forward. "Will, please," she cried, gripping him tightly. "She's gone. You can't save her this way." He turned toward her, eyes wild with grief. "I can't let her die thinking she's alone," he said. "Not again." Something inside her chest gave way. It wasn't pain exactly, more like pressure collapsing inward. Her vision tilted. The sound of the waves grew muffled, distant. She tried to speak, to tell him to stop, but the words wouldn't come. Her knees buckled, and before she hit the ground, she felt his arms catching her, his voice breaking into 1,000 pieces as he screamed her name. The next moments were chaos. Finn, who had been called to the beach after hearing of Will's outburst, arrived just in time. He knelt beside Katie, checking her pulse, shouting for oxygen, his face pale with urgency. "She's in cardiac distress," he yelled. Will stood frozen, the realization crashing over him that his need to fix Luna might have just broken the one person who had always held their family together. Bill arrived minutes later, sprinting across the sand, his usual composure obliterated. The sight of Katie, motionless, her skin ghostly pale, her lips tinged blue, was more than he could bear. For the first time in decades, the man known for ruthless control fell to his knees. As paramedics lifted Katie onto the stretcher, Bill's hands shook uncontrollably. The heart monitor beeped erratically, its shrill rhythm mocking him with every beat. He followed the ambulance all the way to the hospital, the sound of the siren merging with the pounding of his guilt. Every decision he had made, the manipulations, the denials, the arrogance had led to this. He had wanted to protect his family from scandal, to shield Will from Luna's chaos, but in doing so, he had created a pressure cooker that finally exploded in the worst way possible. At the hospital, Finn worked tirelessly to stabilize her. He explained that stress had likely triggered her condition, that her heart had been under strain for weeks. Bill barely heard him. He stood outside the glass partition, staring at her still form, connected to wires and tubes, her chest rising weakly with each mechanical breath. Will stood beside him, shaking, his face streaked with tears. "This is my fault," he whispered. "I pushed her too far." Bill didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible.
"No, son.
This one's on me." That night, neither man left the hospital. Bill sat in the corner of her room, holding her hand and watching the monitors as if sheer willpower could keep the line steady. He thought about all the years Katie had spent keeping him honest, how her compassion had been his compass, her moral clarity the thing that saved him from himself time and again. And now, she was the one paying for his sins. For every lie he had told, every manipulation he had justified, every time he had chosen pride over love. When she finally opened her eyes, the relief in the room was so intense it felt like oxygen returning to lungs long deprived. Her first word was Will's name. He rushed to her side, clutching her hand, sobbing apologies she was too weak to answer. Finn warned that she needed absolute rest, that any emotional strain could trigger another attack. But even as she nodded faintly, Katie's gaze moved to Bill. "You have to stop this," she whispered hoarsely. "All of it. The fighting, the guilt, the noise. It's killing us." In that moment, Bill understood what he had refused to admit for months, that their family wasn't being torn apart by Luna, but by their inability to forgive themselves. She had become the mirror reflecting everything they hated to see: Will's impulsive heart, Bill's corrupted sense of control, Katie's unbearable compassion. The war against Luna had never been about justice. It had been about their fear of what she revealed in them. Over the following days, the Spencers withdrew from the public eye. Bill canceled his meetings, turning his focus entirely to Katie's recovery. He found himself sitting beside her every night, watching her sleep, haunted by the fragility of her breathing. Will stayed close too, quieter now, humbled by how easily he could have lost her. The world outside continued its chaos, the media spinning stories about Luna's disappearance, the activists demanding reform, but inside the hospital room, time seemed to slow. There were moments when Katie dreamed she could hear Luna's voice, soft, distant, echoing from somewhere beyond the noise. Sometimes it said nothing at all, sometimes it whispered forgiveness. She didn't know if it was real or just her conscience, but each time, she woke with a strange sense of calm. Perhaps forgiveness wasn't something the Spencers had to earn from Luna, it was something they had to give each other. When she was finally discharged, the first thing she asked was to see the sea again. Bill hesitated, but agreed. They drove together to the same beach where she had collapsed weeks earlier. The sand was cool beneath their feet. The waves rolled gently, indifferent to human pain. Will stood a few feet away, staring at the horizon where Luna had once vanished, where his past and future seemed to blur. Katie reached out, taking his hand, then Bill's. "We can't undo what's been done," she said softly. "But we can stop letting it destroy us." The three of them stood there for a long time, the wind carrying away the echoes of everything that had nearly broken them. Somewhere, the ghost of Luna lingered, part tragedy, part redemption, part unfinished story. But for the first time, she wasn't a threat or a shadow. She was a reminder that love, when twisted by fear, could destroy, but when faced with forgiveness, could heal. Bill squeezed Katie's hand, feeling her pulse steady beneath his thumb, fragile but alive. He looked at his family, the empire he had almost lost, and realized that this, not the company or the power or the legacy, was what needed saving. The sea roared in the distance, endless and merciless, but the Spencers no longer feared it. They had already learned the hardest truth, that even in the aftermath of betrayal and guilt, the heart, if tended carefully, could still find its rhythm again. The sea was the only witness that night, and even it refused to tell the truth. Under the silver wash of the moon, the waves struck the shore in uneven rhythms, as though echoing the chaos that had erupted just moments before. The gunshot had cut through the storm like a final punctuation mark on a tragedy long in the making, one sound, one flash, and then nothing but the furious roar of the ocean swallowing every scream. When the tide receded hours later, it left behind nothing but fragments, a single shoe tangled in kelp, a shattered phone, and a dark smear of blood on the sand that the waves could never quite erase. There was no body. There were no answers. Only questions that spread like fire across Los Angeles, dividing the city and the audience alike. The confrontation had been inevitable, a collision written into every choice that had brought them to that desolate beach. Luna had returned to the scene of her first escape, drawn back to the water, like a ghost retracing its final steps. Will had followed, driven by guilt and something dangerously close to love, while Bill and Finn had raced there for reasons neither of them fully understood, one to protect his legacy, the other to uncover the truth. When the shot rang out, each of them saw something different. Bill swore he saw Luna fall. Will claimed she ran into the sea. Finn said the shot came from the cliffs, from somewhere unseen. And by the time the police arrived, the tide had already washed away the evidence. By dawn, the beach was sealed off with yellow tape, and the speculation began. Reporters flooded the coastline, broadcasting live from the dunes where the faint scent of gunpowder still lingered. The headlines screamed contradictions. Tragic end for Luna Noza. Spencer scandal explodes. Murder or suicide. The only constant was uncertainty, and that uncertainty became a kind of addiction for everyone watching. Bill Spencer, ever the strategist, was the first to seize control of the narrative. Standing before a wall of cameras, he delivered a somber statement that sounded more rehearsed than heartfelt. He described the event as a terrible accident, suggesting that Luna, emotionally unstable and overwhelmed by her illness, had taken her own life. "She was a troubled young woman," he said gravely. "We did everything we could to help her." Behind the mask of composure, however, Bill's mind was spinning. The blood on the sand didn't look like a suicide. And somewhere in the chaos of that night, he had heard something else, a second gunshot, distant but distinct, swallowed by the wind before anyone else could react. He dismissed it publicly, but it haunted him privately. Finn refused to accept the suicide narrative. As a doctor, as a man who had seen the physical evidence of violence, he couldn't ignore the inconsistencies. The blood pattern was wrong, the angle of the shot improbable. "She didn't shoot herself," he told Will during one of their late-night conversations. Someone wanted her silenced. Will didn't answer. He sat staring at the waves, his face pale and unreadable. He wanted to believe Luna was alive. The alternative, that he had watched her die and done nothing, was too unbearable to face. Rumors began to spread faster than the police could control them. A fisherman claimed he saw a figure being dragged toward a black van that night. A local bartender swore he recognized Luna's bracelet on a woman who paid in cash and disappeared down the coastal road at dawn. Online forums exploded with theories. Some insisted she had been abducted by the same shadowy group that once framed her. Others believed she had staged the entire scene to fake her death and start over. There were even whispers that someone within the Spencer family had orchestrated it all, to cover up secrets buried deeper than anyone dared to imagine. The uncertainty transformed Luna from a woman into a myth. In the weeks that followed, every new clue contradicted the last. The autopsy reports Bill promised never materialized because there was no body to examine. The gun recovered from the beach bore no fingerprints. The DNA tests on the blood were inconclusive, too degraded by seawater to confirm whose it was. Each revelation deepened the divide among those who had once stood together. Will was unraveling. Every night he returned to the beach, pacing the shoreline like a man possessed. He replayed the night in his mind endlessly, the sound of Luna's voice carried by the wind, the flash of metal, the scream that wasn't hers but could have been. Sometimes he swore he heard her calling to him through the waves. Sometimes he dreamed of her walking out of the sea, drenched and smiling, accusing him and forgiving him in the same breath. Sleep became impossible. His grief was raw, but worse than grief was the not knowing. It hollowed him out, leaving nothing but questions. Finn tried to help, throwing himself into the investigation with the clinical precision of a surgeon dissecting a wound. He combed through surveillance footage, tracked down witnesses, even bribed a coroner to run additional tests on the blood samples. What he found disturbed him: traces of a tranquilizer, the kind used in professional abductions. It suggested planning, precision. This was no chaotic confrontation gone wrong. It was a cleanup. When he brought the evidence to Bill, the older man's reaction was cold. "Let it go," Bill said, his voice low. "You don't understand what you're playing with." Finn didn't believe him. He left that night convinced that Bill knew more than he was admitting. Behind the scenes, the investigation took on a darker tone. The police, pressured by political and corporate interests, quietly downgraded the case from homicide to missing person. Publicly, they echoed Bill's version of events. Privately, files were sealed, witnesses dismissed, leads buried. But the silence only fueled speculation. Luna's name trended globally for weeks. Hashtags emerged: Justice for Luna, Luna Lives, Spencer Secrets. The public fascination turned morbid, and yet it kept growing. Everyone wanted to know the same thing: was Luna dead, or had she become the ghost haunting her own story? Katie, still fragile from her cardiac collapse weeks earlier, found herself drawn into the maelstrom once more. She watched her son deteriorate under the pressure, saw her husband bury the truth under layers of damage control, and felt the same dread that had nearly stopped her heart return with a vengeance. "If she's alive," she whispered to Bill one night, "you have to tell me." Bill didn't answer. He simply poured another drink and stared out the window toward the invisible line where ocean met sky. There were things he couldn't say, not because he didn't know them, but because admitting them might destroy what little of his family he still had left. As weeks turned into months, three competing truths emerged, each with its own believers, each capable of rewriting everything. The first, the one Bill clung to publicly, was the tragedy of suicide. Luna, overcome by despair and terminal illness, had ended her own life. It was neat, poetic in a cruel way, and it absolved everyone of responsibility. It let the Spencers mourn quietly, the media move on, and the empire recover its footing. But deep down, even Bill didn't believe it. The second theory belonged to Finn, and to those who refused to accept easy answers. It was a theory of conspiracy, that Luna had been silenced by forces with too much to lose if she lived. Her knowledge of corporate secrets, her connection to Will, her impending testimony about corruption in the prison system, all of it made her a target. Finn traced money transfers, communications, hidden files, all leading back to an unnamed offshore account tied loosely to Spencer Publications. When he confronted Bill with the evidence, Bill's face darkened. "You're looking in the wrong place," he said. But Finn couldn't shake the conviction that somewhere within the labyrinth of power, Luna had been erased deliberately. The third possibility, whispered first as fantasy and then as prophecy, was that Luna was still alive. There were reports, uncorroborated but persistent, of a woman matching her description seen in small coastal towns up and down the Pacific. A scarred woman buying painkillers at a pharmacy in Monterey. A stranger leaving white lilies on the graves of women who died in prison. Each sighting reignited the frenzy, each photograph analyzed frame by frame. The possibility that Luna might be alive transformed her from a tragedy into a legend. She was no longer just a victim or a villain. She had become the embodiment of every unresolved question about truth, justice, and survival. For Will, the ambiguity was both curse and salvation. As long as there was no body, he could believe she might return. He clung to that possibility with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to driftwood. Every night, he listened to the waves, waiting for a sign. Sometimes he thought he heard her laughter hidden in the wind. Sometimes he imagined her voice whispering from the tide, not accusing, not forgiving, just existing. He stopped trying to explain it to anyone. It was easier to let them think he was losing his mind than to admit that hope, however delusional, was the only thing keeping him alive. Meanwhile, the show itself, the universe of the bold and the beautiful, fed on that ambiguity. The writers left breadcrumbs in every episode, a phone ringing in an empty room, an envelope sliding under a door, a half-seen silhouette watching from the cliffs. Each clue contradicted the last, forcing the audience to choose their own truth. The fandom splintered into factions. Team Justice believed in Finn's investigation. Team Redemption believed Luna had survived and would return to expose everyone. Team Fate believed Bill was right, and that Luna's story had ended where it began, with the sea. The debates spilled across social media, fan forums, and talk shows. Every frame was dissected, every pause analyzed. And yet, beneath the noise, something deeper lingered. The question was no longer just what happened to Luna, it was what she represented. Was she a monster who manipulated love to mask her sins? A victim crushed beneath the machinery of power? Or both at once, a mirror reflecting the darkness of everyone who had ever loved her? The beauty of her disappearance was its refusal to give closure. It left space for guilt, for imagination, for fear. Months later, Will stood again on the same beach, now calm and deceptively peaceful. The tide had washed away the last traces of that bloody night, but he could still feel its echoes in the air. He knelt, touching the wet sand where he thought she had fallen, and whispered, "I'm still here." Behind him, the sun was rising, staining the sky gold and crimson, colors of hope and danger intertwined. Somewhere far out at sea, a small boat moved across the horizon, its figure cloaked in mist. For a moment, Will thought he saw her, hair whipping in the wind, eyes fixed on the shore. Then she was gone, swallowed by light. The screen faded to black. No answers. No confirmations. Only the lingering question that would haunt the bold and the beautiful for months to come. Did Luna die that night, or did she become something else entirely, a myth too powerful to stay buried? And that was the genius of it, the chaos, the heartbreak, the uncertainty. In keeping Luna's fate unresolved, the show had created not an ending, but an echo. A mystery that would live in every fan's imagination, in every debate, in every whispered theory long after the tide had claimed the truth for itself.